and I'm not complacent about being amongst neighbors and friends. What I miss the most are the hugs, and maybe soon we'll be able to do that. A few words about this evening. I'm going to read from two manuscripts. One is about the hard-fought tale of adoptions of our two daughters, Hattie and Tilly, and that book is called Straight Through the Labyrinth. By the way, if anybody knows a good literary agent, let me know, because I need one, but oh, never mind. And that book I worked on for several years. It's very important to me. It's a narrative, and I just want the story out there. The second book I wrote over the quarantine, and it's a book of vignettes. It's a sort of a second volume of the one I wrote last, which was called Host of Memories. This one is called Telling Tales. It's not a verb, telling, but an adjective, meaning revealing. So I'm not telling tales out of school. You can leave now if you're disappointed. So the evening is about, it's sort of three little parts. It's about what I have become, the proud and loving member of our two-father family, of our two girls, who were adopted from China long ago. It's also an evening about whence I came, and it's an evening about my lifelong passion for China. So I'd like to read don't worry, it's not long. And at the end, it would be lovely to chat. Hold on a second, I have to deal with clips. So I'm going to start out with the prologue to the book on the adoptions. It's very short, but it sort of gives you an inkling of how difficult it was. I think you straight folks have a much easier time than we did, I can assure you. But we'll just talk about that another time. The prologue is titled, "The Ox Shook. That is the origin of earthquakes." It's a quote from an old Chinese classic. The terrace of our apartment building jutted out over Barker Road, the penultimate stop on Hong Kong's peak tram. When my partner Julian and I would find ourselves suspended on our balcony in the darkness, or cheek by jowl with guests, we were dwarfed by a vista too splendid to be real. It was the perfect vantage point for watching the annual fireworks high above Victoria Harbor. This was to be the very last Chinese New Year extravaganza under British rule before Hong Kong reverted to mainland sovereignty. Thus, we invited some friends over, largely from my days in Princeton and Beijing, along with some sudden acquaintances. It would soon be time for us to herd our guests out onto the vertiginous perch with champagne flutes in hand to toast 1997, which would be the year of the ox. Since the festivities took place on the 15th and final day of Chinese New Year celebrations, well before midnight, the finale was something of a relief. In fact, the hoopla was subdued because we were on the cusp of uncertain political transformation. Despite the uncertainties awaiting us on the other side of the pyrotechnics, Julian and I were gradually allowing ourselves to imagine the coming of a baby, though we were not sufficiently at ease to share the news with our companions. For Julian, it was incredulity that determined his silence, but my own rigid hush was born of profound superstition. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. Even the slightest whiff of confidence could be mistaken for hubris, I feared, sabotaging my quest to become a father. Considering whence I came, my interest in fatherhood was hard to fathom. Having survived a childhood shattered by the knock-on tremors of my parents' divorce in the 1950s, I took myself out of harm's way by avoiding ties that imperfectly bind. Although dutiful to my family, I managed to remain aloof as well. Dodging a replay of my sad past mattered to me more than the risk of peaceful resignation in the present. I gradually came to realize, though, that the legacy of my flawed youth could only be addressed by the creation of my very own family. Such forward-looking resolve was no lame effort to turn my back on history, but rather to use it as a springboard into promise. Even after accepting my homosexuality, thereby making fatherhood all the more implausible in the world of binary choice, I held to my mission. China had happily hijacked my life, with Confucius and then the I Ching, the Book of Changes, coming to the fore of my intellectual passions. I studied Chinese in Taiwan. During the early 1970s, China was still off limits, by the way. Got a PhD from Princeton and did a stint of college teaching. Although an academic career seemed my natural port of call, circumstance and choice skewed by trajectory, launching me into the pinball machine of life. I realized that freedom and security could both be on the same side of a coin. How else could I have become a groundbreaking banker in Beijing during the 1980s? A few months after those fireworks had well faded from the sky, I received a letter from Caritas, the agency handling the adoption of our child from China. It tersely stated that there would be a lengthy delay in the process due to unforeseen circumstances. The message landed with a thud, denying me the wiggle room of optimism that I could always manage to summon. Nonetheless, I called my congenial contact at the agency, breezily referring to the letter as though my charm and cheer could miraculously vaporize it. She was unusually flat, hardly the chirpy problem solver that I had come to rely upon along twists in the road. Not only was she pessimistic about the present, but she offered no promise about next steps. She then abruptly rang off. I was about to get caught up in the very history that I had long studied. My baby was now a pawn in a game being publicly hard fought right under my nose. Of all things, Mrs. Thatcher's visit to Beijing in 1982 came to mind. After Deng Xiaoping had read her the Riot Act during negotiations to determine Hong Kong's fate. Whoops. Oh my goodness. Of all things. Hang in there. Oh no. Sorry. I'm on the edge of my seat. I don't know what happened to the last page.
Paraphrase it.
I will paraphrase it, okay. Oh, I got it. Wait a minute. Hong Kong's fate. Okay, let me reread the After Deng Xiaoping had read her the Riot Act during negotiations to determine Hong Kong's fate, she took a tumble on the steps when leaving the Great Hall of the People. The future was suddenly looking far more precarious than it had on our balcony when toasting in the Year of the Ox. Thank you. Sorry about the screw up. We did get the kids in the end. The next little story addresses my family, and this is I mean, it wasn't all bleak. Some of it was pretty comical, and this is one that is, every time I read it, it makes me laugh. So don't hang me out to dry, okay? And it's called Diane and Vic. My eldest first cousin by a quarter of a century, Roy, was a legendary Hollywood agent. He represented the Beatles on their visit to Los Angeles, hiding the Fab Four in his house. He also looked after Bette Midler, shared digs with Neil Simon's brother between their divorces, becoming the co-subject of The Odd Couple, and did the theatrical bidding for both Diane Carroll and her husband, the crooner, Vic Damone. I'm glad we have the right demographic here, because I'm sure nobody else would know what the hell I was talking about, but never mind all that. Many members of my family had met Diane over the years. She was even known to pop in on Aunt Marcy for brunch in Forest Hills, en route from the airport into the city. My aunt would feign embarrassment if a neighbor happened to ring her doorbell and enter, mouth dropping open, to see the star chowing down on bagel and lox. Roy's secretary called me midweek in London, relaying his invitation to see the new hit show Miss Saigon on Friday night. He'd be accompanying Diane over the pond, across the pond. I usually didn't go for the Hollywood routine of first names only, but I knew that Roy's longtime client, Diane Carroll, the sweetest of stars, who was ravishingly beautiful, was the reason for the trip over. I accepted on the spot. As usual, Roy would appear out of nowhere, sprinkle a cloud of pixie dust, and be gone in a trice. I turned up at the Theatre Royal to be greeted by Roy in front of the theater. He had already seated Diane in our box, so we ran up the stairs, taking two at a time. Lots of hugs and kisses, and then we sat through an evening stolen by a helicopter. It was such a lousy show, but there was a big helicopter in it. That's all I remember about it, sorry. During the course of the performance, though, I noticed Roy darting in and out, but I was used to his flighty routine and paid it little mind. The show over, I heard Roy assure Diane that the milk would be delivered in time for her late-night bath at the Ritz. In these days, before mobile phones, arranging for a tub full of milk in the middle of London, as his charge sat in a dark theater, was no mean task. A limousine awaited us, and we headed over to the Ritz for supper. I could not help but internally smile at having made excuses to dear friends up in North London who had invited me to their Passover Seder. The smile only got broader when the fawning waiter made it sound as though there was simply nothing worth eating on the menu except the smoked lobster. As the evening unfolded, Roy could not have been kinder in featuring my interest in China, engaging Diane on my behalf, sending me off aglow into the evening. On Saturday morning, my friend Rudolph called me, asking if I'd like to go with him up to Camden Lock. Since I was on the prowl for Victorian fireplace footmen, which I had begun collecting, the excursion to this precinct of antique shops was appealing. It was a day of rare spring warmth as we strolled around the lanes. After diving into a large and cluttered store, we went our separate ways down random aisles. His disinterest in fireplace paraphernalia was matched by mine for his passion in Baroque frou-frou. I soon came upon a trove of footmen and happily got stuck into reading their detail labels. Suddenly, Rudolph was standing next to me. Assuming he had come over to take a look at the footman, I was swiftly in full sail about the brass pieces arrayed before us. Breathlessly, he interrupted only to tell me that he had just seen the most beautiful woman in the world. Considering that we were both gay, I was flummoxed by his enthusiasm. He took my arm and led me to a junction of two aisles where a woman, her back to us, was perusing a shelf of carriage clocks. When she happened to turn and suddenly spot me, she gushed, "Peter, it was such fun last evening. The lobster was better than the show." Rudolph's eyes were out on stalks. She went on to tell me that Roy was looking for me, and I should give him a call at the hotel where a message would be waiting for me. I then apologized to Diane for neglecting to introduce Rudolph, still agog, and then excused myself to find a phone. I retrieved Roy's message and returned to the Star and her admirer. I was to meet Roy at an address unknown to me in the West End. With my trusty A to Z, that's a map, with my trusty A to Z, London in hand, I was soon on my way. My destination turned out to be a faded hotel off Shaftesbury Avenue, where Roy was awaiting me under a shabby awning. Before I even had a moment to recount the startling coincidence up at Camden Lock, he told me why I was there. We were about to meet the officers of the local Vic Damone fan club. And and he needed me to pose as a representative of the Los Angeles mothership. There was simply no point in resisting my irresistible cousin. He assured me I'd be great, even though I wasn't even sure who Vic Damone was, as we were going up the steps into the lobby. Roy asked a porter for directions to a room with a comically grand name, and we were shown the way. En route, he asked a clerk to dispatch a waiter to swiftly appear with a drinks trolley. Awaiting us inside the drabbest of rooms, with a faux fireplace and pelmets so heavy they looked as though they might bring down the ceiling, was a bedraggled couple who jumped to attention as we walked in. Roy was masterful as he seated the nervous boffins. Radiating a beatific regard that so disarmed them that they were unable to readily focus on the waiter asking for their drinks orders. As Roy relayed wishes from Vic to his guests, the gentleman eagerly proffered materials from the local chapter of the fan club. The woman then turned to me and asked about activities back in California. In the headlights, I was shocked into composing my thoughts. I then shamelessly embellished Roy's message from Vic and went on to express Diane's delight that I would be meeting with the officers of the club. I went on to volunteer that I had just left her, and she asked that I relay back the details of our meeting when we next saw each other. The drinks were served, and I was grilled about sightseeing opportunities in Southern California. Since there was to be a global gathering of the Damone fan clubs, which our guests would be attending, they wanted to turn the event into a sightseeing opportunity. An area about which I knew little, I fell back on distant memories from my childhood, choosing to dwell upon Knott's Berry Farm, grandly dismissing Disneyland as commercial tat entre nous. I was then decorously presented with a Vic Damone fan club pin and a membership card which they personalized with my name as I expressed delight. Our guests now at ease after sipping their drinks, Roy and I then graciously bid them farewell. Once out in the fading afternoon light, I had the feeling that Roy was beholding me as a fraudster in training and proud of my performance. The pleasure I derived from his regard outweighed my shame at deceiving Vic's fans. He gave me a big kiss and was off, leaving me covered in pixie dust. He married and divorced the same woman 3 times. There's plenty more to say about it, but it'll keep. The third and last little story is about my time back in Beijing in the early 1980s. It was a very difficult time, and the China of today is inconceivable when I think about the China that I lived in then. And we moved back to America in 2010, and I'm sure the China of today is unrecognizable from the China that we saw in 2010. but I think it's very important for people to understand just what it was like in the early 80s. And it was grim, it was difficult, but it was pretty comical. And there was more shtick than you can imagine. That's Cantonese. This little story is called A Life of Crime. Fortunately for me, being a banker in Beijing during the early 1980s was not about numbers. Rather, I was called upon to be party planner, concierge, shrink, and diplomat. Immediately upon arrival in 1982, I was tasked with arranging the opening festivities for our representative office. Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company, as sort of non-existent as Vic Damone, was one of the first American banks to establish an office in China, an event warranting a big splash. I was fortunate to have Lucy by my side, an assistant who gave me a crash course in getting things done. A woman who had left Shanghai prior to Mao's takeover. She had had a distinguished career in Hong Kong at the U.S. consulate. Whenever her name came up in a group, it was always in the context of her masterful engineering of a disinformation campaign which had thrown the press off the scent of Henry Kissinger's furtive visit to China and not to Pakistan. When she retired from government service, she crafted a second career back in China, where her skills as a formidable fixer would be well in demand. We scoured the city for an appropriate venue to hold the bank's opening ceremonies, finally deciding on the grand ballroom of the Beijing Hotel. After intense discussions with the general manager, and the deal was struck, Lucy commanded that I stay put as she dashed off, leaving me all by myself, dwarfed by the grandeur of the lobby's faded elegance. Upon her return, she shoved a checkbook in front of me with a pen in the ready and barked, "Qian Zi," which means sign. When I looked at the amount, $129,000, my eyes came out on stalks. But my signing authority is $500, I whined. "Qian Zi, sign it," she snapped. Again she was off, returning from the Bank of China with a shopping bag filled with cash. The Beijing Hotel would not take a check, and credit cards were unknown in those days. We then tracked down the manager, handed over the money, and secured the venue. Since the event would be held around Chinese New Year's, festivities begin 2 weeks before and linger for another 2 weeks after the big day. I got it in my head that lion dancers weaving amongst the tables would be just the thing, and acrobats too. For some reason, though, getting permission for the dancers to leave the stage at the front of the ballroom turned into a formidable challenge. Although Lucy was exasperated when I dug in my heels, she took it as a personal challenge and prevailed. I reckon that the success of the event in February 1983 made my career, and it certainly joined Lucy and me at the hip, a partnership born of necessity and duress. Mr. McGillicuddy, the legendary chairman of the bank, along with his entourage, were thrilled by the china that Lucy and I had laid on for them. They had not a clue about the dramas attending their stay in Beijing right to the end. When it was time for his departure, I was physically prevented by a thug dressed like a waiter from leaving the Diaoyutai State Guest House to see my guests off at the airport because the bill had not yet been paid in full. With his arm threaded through mine, I could do more than stand on the front steps and lamely wave farewell. Precisely because things had gone so well, Mr. McGillicuddy was forever sending lofty executives in my direction. There I would be, sitting in my office, shoehorned into a room in the Jianguo Hotel, and a stitched-up captain of industry would appear, bearing the chairman's greetings. The combination of Mr. McGillicuddy's imprimatur and the neediness of a guest cowed by the cultural assault of simply being in China placed me at his disposal, and his wife's too. Since my living quarters were on the 4th floor of the hotel, no doubt I had the shortest commute in the bank. I would often find myself sitting with people of great stature who had sprawled out on my sofa in need of guidance after a puzzling meeting with senior officials in the government. There I was, holding forth with the head of Union Carbide or the Secretary of the Treasury that I still had no proper title with the bank mattered little. Then, when left on my own, I would have panic attacks about these counseling sessions, anxious that I might have endangered Sino-American relations, a brand of disquiet that itself reflected the topsy-turvy life I was living. But it was the demands of my guest spouse that really put me in my place. With little choice when it came to shopping, aside from cashmere in the friendship store, its eccentric and charming handicrafts held little appeal to grand foreigners. I would often take guests to a wonderful carpet store I had found, the charm of its managers more than offsetting its dreary interior. But the pleasure of the excursion was a rod for my own back. The store was not permitted to ship internationally, a task left to this obliging bank representative. I was far too often lugging a well-wrapped carpet along a queue at the Central Post Office, praying that my tissue paper forms had been filled out correctly. The problem was, though, that with each successful arrival of a shipment stateside, my reputation as a stevedore was transformed into that of a miracle worker. There were banking issues, too, though. During these nascent days of commerce in China, one matter confounded American exporters. When would payment be forthcoming on a letter of credit, the instrument underpinning trade between our two countries? No one had been able to crack the Bank of China's code to predict the remittance of funds to America. Such a baffling routine, often dismissed as inscrutable, did not prevent my visiting the bank in hopes of helping out frustrated clients. Even if I failed in my mission, I at least could say, hand on heart, that I had given it my best shot in a telex, responding to a request for follow-up. One afternoon, en route to the Bank of China, I asked Mr. Chi, my driver and major domo, expats were not permitted to drive then, to swing by the friendship store. The Stalinist emporium carried foreign goods that could only be purchased with special currency denied to the locals. I had heard a rumor. There was instant coffee available. Though there was a quota of only one jar, I just about skipped down the steps into Lighte with my quarry in hand. I had also bought some special cooking oil, unavailable in the local market, for my driver's wife. Mr. Chi then dropped me at the Bank of China headquarters, a confection of a building that was falling to bits just to the west of Tiananmen Square. In the main hall, I asked for Mr. Pu Da-chung, who was my primary point of contact. We were about the same age. His father was a banking executive who had been posted to London and had married an Englishwoman. No doubt his father's overseas experience, along with his own Anglo-Chinese pedigree, had cost him dearly during the Cultural Revolution. I had only to feel his sandpaper hand when we greeted each other to again be reminded of his unspoken ordeal. He was later to commit suicide. When I yet again asked for help with a letter of credit, we shared a knowing glance of futility as he steered me to one of the clerks who had gotten up from a huge table behind the counter to partake in a charade of further inquiry. We recognized each other, and I casually placed my carryall next to me. After sharing the usual pleasantries, but before I could even mention the letter of credit, He playfully asked what was in the brown bag sticking out of the bigger one, holding it. Rather than making him uneasy by taking it out in full sight, even such a minor perception of an exchange could prove tricky. I told him it was instant coffee. He was puzzled, clearly not understanding me. Certain that my Chinese was inadequate, I began describing it as best I could, finally grasping the fact that the concept simply did not exist. I asked if he'd like to try some, immediately realizing that the offer itself was problematic. Shifting gears, I told him that I was very cold and would appreciate a mug of hot water. Since a kettle was always on the boil, my request for a hot drink was of no consequence. He returned with one of those mugs with a cover, along with a cup of tea for himself. I then asked for a spoon. Upon his return, I managed to scoop out some instant coffee by stealth and place the crystals into the boiling water. I then swapped the cups around, staring right into his eyes, his confusion turning to pleasure as he took a cue from my mischievous expression. We then began to discuss the tedium of letters of credit, well before our beverages had cooled down. When the usual impasse had been reached, I suggested that we sip from our cups. Upon lifting the cover, delight registered on his face even before he tasted the coffee, its steamy aroma taking him by surprise. I wondered aloud if others in the banking hall behind him, seated around a square of 4 tables, with their abacuses clicking and chops pounding on red ink pads, might also like to taste the coffee. He shared a glance, and then he quietly presented cups one by one, with my repeating sleight of hand enabling a treat for all. I then watched the magic of the coffee casually circulate around the table as cups were passed and lids lifted. As I was preparing to take my leave, the clerk started talking business again, much to my surprise. A very Chinese ballet was now getting underway. Reiterating the futility of my current request, he suggested that I return in a week, offering that he just might then be able to provide some assistance. I did return the following week, armed with instant coffee. Again, I served all the clerks in the banking hall. Mr. Pooh, my handler, who had not been party to the coffee clutch originally, appeared and invited me into his office, which he had never done before. I asked if he might be thirsty. Without a word, he fetched a cup of boiling water, into which I brazenly put some instant coffee. He chuckled in delight and casually wondered if I had any issues I wanted to discuss. As a matter of fact, there is something to chat about, I purred, reaching into my breast pocket for a piece of paper listing corporations with long pending payments relating to outstanding letters of credit. In silence, I handed over the company names. Shifting his chair behind me, he then gave me a pencil and read off the dates for remittances, which I was free to quietly divulge to some of my clients on the list. Thus began a weekly ritual, a friendship store drive-by, and a passing of the cups. I did bring my own spoon, though, to ease the coffee distribution. Then, without ever asking for his help, I was regularly provided with helpful information, enabling me to serve my clients well. Back again at the office and hydrating myself sipping tea, I felt like Clark Kent, having morphed into Superman while playing mother and pouring cups of instant coffee for the Bank of China staff. Word started to get around the bank in New York that we had achieved the impossible. I even got a call from Mr. McGillicuddy congratulating me on a breakthrough which distinguished us in the market. He was keen to hear my secret. I playfully told him that he'd just have to wait to learn about my strategy, which brought about this commercial miracle. It was a pleasure now to be known in the bank for something other than the delivery of carpets. comments or questions or anything, or? That's okay. Thank you all for, oh, hello.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When did you write so beautifully, when did you start writing?
Well, it's a funny thing. I was given
Use
a
the-
note. I would
the
be
mic.
sorry. Long ago on Shelter Island, I was given a notebook, and I had a propelling pencil, and I started just carrying it around with me. And then one day, I sat down in front of the drugstore, got some iced coffee, and I took out the notebook and I just started to write. And it was sort of like it was just coming. I sort of felt like a shabby Mozart, you know. It just started coming out and zooming out. And what's really interesting about this whole deal is that although I've kept diaries for years, not Dear Diary with a lot of special stuff, but I've written stuff down. I've never looked back at any of the diaries to retrieve any of the facts. So I'm not sure how memory works. I'm glad I still have it. But it's a strange thing, and the stories keep coming, and I keep remembering things. So it's very pleasurable, actually. Thanks for asking. Yeah, Bill.
Peter, people might be interested in comments on kind of the hardening of relations between China and the West these days.
Now you
A
mean?
little bit of insight as to what's going on, yeah.
Yeah. I sort of don't get it. I don't know why we simply can't be competitors, commercial competitors, because I think that's what it's all about. And I think one of the things that's been cited as a contentious issue is the South China Sea. Well, I think it would be wise for us to remember that China is surrounded by enemies and surrounded by countries that despise China. So it's no walk in the park for China to flex its muscle in that part of the world. And might I remind the rest of us of the Monroe Doctrine, which you can just think about if you'd like to, and how it might be flexed, a Chinese version might be flexed, and how we deal with that. But I really think that the whole tariff business that was started in the last administration was ridiculous. Our countries are too closely aligned now. Our relationships are so complex between the two countries that I know we will get through this. The one flashpoint, the one real flashpoint that I think is probably the most dangerous place in the world is Taiwan. I think if there is any serious declaration of independence by Taiwan or inappropriate support for Taiwan by the United States, China will invade Taiwan. I don't doubt it for a moment. So we better be careful and maintain the one China charade, which both China and Taiwan have been doing since 1949, and it has worked just fine. They both agree, they each agree that there is only one China. It depends upon the vantage point and little else. So I think we should play along with that and continue to keep peace that way. But I think diplomacy, now that we have it back, will prevail, I hope. And a lot of this tough talk is just for domestic consumption, I think. Look, the Chinese play to the grandstand just as we do. So I'm not worried if we see this in the proper context. What do you think, Bill?
I think that makes sense. I think that certainly we're focused on Xi and whether he has kind of set himself up as something more than just the leader of the country in perpetuity.
He already has.
Yeah.
And that's all right. You know, we know what we're dealing with. And I mean, he's got a lot to do in China. He's a busy man. And I mean, whatever you think of the politics of China, to get 650 million people out of poverty is pretty impressive. And I'm a shameless liberal. You know, I don't like totalitarian states and all that kind of stuff. But that is quite a stunning accomplishment. He didn't do this himself, but that's what's happened in China. And one other thing that's worthy of mention. when I used to bang on about human rights, and when I lived in China, when I visited China, when I have Chinese friends, the Chinese genuinely are puzzled by the obsession with human rights amongst Westerners, because what they fear most is instability. And they are willing to give up a lot for a stable society. And believe me, they've had enough instability to kill a horse. I mean, since 1949, forget about all the rest, but since 49, the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine, the Cultural Revolution, about 70 million people died. I'd call that instability. And they don't want any part of that anymore. So they're willing to forego a great deal. So I think that the trade-off to them makes sense. This friend of mine talked about an image of what the Communist Party, a good way to visualize the Communist Party. He said the Communist Party in China is like an anaconda in a chandelier. There's this snake up there above us, doesn't move very much. You don't know when it'll move, but what you need to know is that you don't get close to it. And the further below that anaconda you stay, the less dangerous your life will be. And I think the anaconda is politics in China. You need to stay out of it. I don't think the Chinese care how much money you make, how you go about your lives, but stay out of politics. It's a pretty powerful image, I think. Yeah. Please.
So, being in China in early 1980s, I was there in the early 1980s, and so I know what that was like. But could you predict? I know the Chinese have a history of entrepreneurship and stuff like that. But it was really a socialist, deeply socialist country at that point. Could you have predicted what would happen? I mean, it is pretty incredible to see the changes that have gone on there.
Well, I think I think entrepreneurship can exist in totalitarian governments, under totalitarian governments. And once again, this deal has been made. Go about your business. And just stay away from dangerous things. And it's also interesting, in China, there are these state-owned enterprises, these big conglomerates that are supported by the government. And what's interesting is that beneath that, all these entrepreneurs are very creative, building tremendous businesses. As soon as they get successful, the government engineers a takeover of those new businesses by the state-owned enterprises to keep them alive. So the creativity of the society keeps fueling the dominance of the state-owned enterprises, which is quite an odd pipeline if you think about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's anything immiscible about commerce and a police state.
No, but Deng Xiaoping really kind of got that off the ground, right?
Absolutely. But everyone has wonderful things to say about Deng Xiaoping. He ordered the attack on Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
So as Chairman Mao said, revolution is no dinner party.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Bill.
So with all that, what do you think the vulnerabilities, China's vulnerabilities are?
What I think China's vulnerabilities are, a failing economy. I think that's what really matters in China, and I also think that the Taiwan situation. But if China can't deliver growth, that's really perilous in China, because of the pressure of all these people who keep coming from the countryside with promises of a better life, and which they've seen get delivered. And suddenly, if that isn't delivered, that's a very big problem, I think. And I feel obliged to say something about Hong Kong. We lived in Hong Kong. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to Hong Kong and maybe lived in Hong Kong, which is a fantastic place, a ridiculous place in a certain way. It sort of had no right to exist in a funny kind of way. It was completely artificial. And as soon as 1997 came, anybody who thought otherwise, that this would not come to an end, was smoking the opium that one couldn't get there anymore. I mean, it was really, it was inevitable. And the one country, two systems charade, it was unsustainable. It just wasn't going to happen. And I think what's going to happen now is there's going to be a corridor from Shenzhen to Hong Kong, and the border will disappear. When we first lived there, Hong Kong foreign women used to go to Shenzhen to get knockoff pocketbooks. Now it's a city of 15 million people. And when Deng Xiaoping first visited that city, and he said, you have to build another Hong Kong here, its population was 60,000. So that's what's possible there. It's just an extraordinary thing. It boggles the mind. So. Mary.
I was in China in 2010. I went with a group of friends, and I found the Chinese people very gentle and very appreciative of Americans. We were walking down a street one day, and a mother stopped us, and she said, "Listen to my child, he speaks English." You know, and I thought that was generally, I went to other Asian countries, and I would say China seemed to have the gentlest of people.
Well, I think that I happen to really like the Chinese people. I think they're a lot of fun. They're very quirky. They're very playful. The language itself lends itself to puns. You know, it's a tonal language. There's infinite fooling around with language. And by and large, they only kill each other. They don't kill foreigners. Aren't we fortunate?
Aren't we?
No, so seriously, I mean, it can be a very rough society, and it can also be extremely pleasurable. And I think one is torn by most societies. God knows we're torn in our own now. So I think it's understandable. And I mean, I started studying so long. I started studying China before Nixon went there. So I got one thing right. You know, I was ahead of the curve. So something attracted me tremendously. And Chinese philosophy is truly fascinating. I mean, I would urge you all to look into it if you can. It's truly fascinating. And I'll leave you with the most interesting fact, well, the most interesting idea that I learned about China, that China is the only significant civilization in the history of the world that has no creation myth. How do you like that? So think about that one. That's absolutely fascinating. So, yes, it is. Yeah, yeah. I saw another hand. Matthias.
Yeah, like just that you mentioned the Book of Changes as kind of a defining book for you. It seems like it would be hard to translate that into 80s banking in China for you.
Oh, or so you think. I mean, what I learned was when I left academia and went into banking, that one needn't have surgery to take out the classics and put in accounting. They can exist side by side. No, but that was a hard thing for me to understand. I thought it either or. There's either Manichaean, either or stuff. It doesn't have to be that way. But I think with what I learned from the I Ching, and largely through understanding Jung, who wrote a very famous introduction to a translation of the I Ching, which I can bore you rigid with this, so I won't. But what I learned was that to be alive to the unexpected and to welcome it is a great gift. And I think that's really important. And I was never disturbed by odd things happening, because I never sort of believed that things had to be causal all the time. I think that Jung talks about this idea of acausality, that things can be connected that aren't in a line, and there are things there are ideas that assault you at once, which don't necessarily make sense at the same time, but you need to pay attention. And just one last thing. So believe it or not, from the Chinese classics to banking to my sunset years, and now I'm hooked on quantum mechanics. because it's really very much related to the I Ching, because the behavior of some subatomic particles are not as what we would believe they should be. So you can drum me out of the choir for this. If you think I forgot to take my meds, I'm sorry. But it makes sense to me. So,
Very good.
is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Myra.
just wanted to say that Abraham Joshua Heschel says that we should see life every day with radical amazement. It's the same thing. It's the same exact idea. Of just look at the wonder of the world. Don't ask how it all happened.
And it's amazing how many people have tidy little minds
Right.
that you just want to kill them because they're just so dreary. And I think I'm very grateful to. I had sort of my upbringing was difficult, but it was also somewhat madcap. And then to have been given this gift of China, for which I'm very grateful, that made me look at the world in a very, very different way. And it worked out. And I love Hay Beach. David, oh, okay. My neighbor from Hay Beach. Any other questions or comments or anything? Thank you very much for coming.